Things have happened, but I'm here. So thank you all for being here. This is wonderful to see you all here. We have a great panel, lots of great people, lots of great information up here on the stage, but also in the audience. I see lots of brilliant colleagues in the audience. So I might refer some questions to you all and say, hey, what's your answer? So welcome everyone to the panel on investing in forgotten places and people. I'm Algernon Austin, the Director for Race and Economic Justice at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Before we start, I want to do a quick setting of the context so that you understand our thinking behind the panel and a little bit about what the panel is about. So in the first quarter of this year, 2023, the national unemployment rate was 3.5%. And this is great news. This is a low national rate, definitely should be celebrated. But it's important to remember that the national average does not apply to every community. There are still many communities facing very high levels of unemployment and joblessness. For example, in the first quarter of this year, in Yuma, Arizona, the unemployment rate was 8.5%, more than double the national average. The unemployment rate was 9.3% in Calhoun County, West Virginia. It was nearly 11% in Flint, Michigan. 13.2% in the Kusilvak census area of Alaska, and nearly 20% in Reedley, California. 20% is Depression-era unemployment rate, so serious distress in that community, as well as many other communities across the country. So these are some of the places that tend to be forgotten when we focus exclusively on the national unemployment rate. The latest unemployment data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that in addition to the 6 million unemployed, there are 5.5 million people who would like to work, but because of technicalities in the unemployment definition, are not counted as unemployed. There's an additional 3.7 million who would like to work full-time, but can only find part-time work. When you add these numbers together, you get 15.3 million. So we have we can say that we still have a jobs deficit of 15.3 million jobs. This joblessness is not uniformly distributed across the country, but it is concentrated in the most disadvantaged communities. And these disadvantaged communities can be found in every state in the nation. The country's latest infrastructure report card from the American Society of Civil Engineers gives the country a C- grade, which is a terrible grade given that we're one of the richest countries on the planet. But this national average also hides infrastructure disparities. Infrastructure, like economic assets generally, and we really have to remember that to think about infrastructure as an economic asset is stratified by class and by race. Which communities do you think have schools without proper heating and cooling systems, with the dirtiest air and water, with the worst roads and internet access? These problems are not found in America's wealthiest communities, but they are found in America's poorest communities. Infrastructure is not stratified as finely as other economic assets because it tends to depend on geography rather than on the household or the individual. But we know that not every community has access to infrastructure of equal quality. There is also a disparate impact to bad infrastructure, even when groups are equally exposed. For example, in Mississippi, the roads receive a D- rating. In South Haven, Mississippi, the damage from bad roads costs the average driver about $2,000 a year. This amounts to 3% of the median household income for white Mississippians. This situation is bad enough for white Mississippians, but because black Mississippians are paid only half of what their white neighbors are paid, the roughly $2,000 amounts to about 6% of the median income for black Mississippians. So bad infrastructure can pose a greater economic hardship on low income and low wealth households, and low income and low wealth households are also more likely to be exposed to bad infrastructure. So these are some of the reasons why we have to invest in the places and people that too many people forget when we look at national statistics. In the panel this morning, we heard some great information about how the Biden administration, through policies within the Inflation Reduction Act, are targeting some disadvantaged communities. So that's a real positive step in the right direction. But I think we can all agree that much more needs to be done. There's still much more disadvantage. And hopefully going forward, we can get the country to do much more for these forgotten places and people. And with that, we have a great panel. I won't go into all their wonderful bios, but I'll just give you their titles quickly. So we have first Anthony Baber, the Communications and Culture Director at Detroit Action, and then Valerie Wilson, the Director for the Economic Policy Institute's Program on Race, Ethnicity, and the Economy, and then Melissa Young, a Principal Consultant for The Intersect, and Ted Boettner, a Senior Researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute. Okay, so with that, we're just going to dive in and talk about what can be done for these forgotten places and people. So Biden, Valerie, the Biden Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or which is also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, invests about $500 billion new dollars in infrastructure. This money is desperately needed and beneficial to improving our C- infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers, however, says we still need considerably more investments to get our infrastructure in proper shape. I know some people, when they hear infrastructure investments, they don't think about people of color. Do people of color benefit from infrastructure investments?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. Thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel today. And I really love that question because there are so many layers to actually answering it. Just to back up a bit, there are really two benefits to be gained from infrastructure investments. One is the obvious, the physical improvements that are needed, like many of those that you've already described. But the other benefit that comes from infrastructure investments is jobs, job creation. And since physical infrastructure is very much a place-based investment, whether or not communities of color benefit from those investments is based on where those investments are made. But the other piece of that would be then the number and the quality of jobs that are ultimately created from those investments. And I'm a labor economist, so I'm going to speak primarily from the perspective of the job creation issue. And then others may want to weigh in on the specific infrastructure needs in different communities. In 2020, EPI produced a report where we estimated that nearly 7 million jobs would be supported by a 4-year, $2 trillion investment in infrastructure, clean energy, and energy efficient improvements, combined with trade and industrial policies that eliminate the US trade deficit. Now, the second part of that, eliminating the trade deficit, is really important to this conversation because that would dramatically increase the demand for American-produced goods, which will have a huge impact on how many manufacturing jobs are created in the US. So we see that being sort of a two-pronged approach approach to making investments in infrastructure actually reach into the communities where they're most needed. Now, nearly half of those 7 million jobs, or about 3 million, that will be supported by those kinds of investments and rebalancing trade, would be good middle-class jobs in manufacturing and construction. Now, these industries historically and traditionally have offered great employment opportunities for non-college educated workers. This means that these are jobs that would be widely available. They don't have such narrowly restrictive requirements that only a small slice of the population would have access to them. The other benefit of jobs being created in those industries are that those are industries that are more highly unionized than a lot of other industries, and in particular, I will say the service sector. And I bring that into the discussion because manufacturing and construction jobs are also the kinds of jobs that we lost over the last 2 decades as a result of our poor response to global competition. And at the same time that we were losing those jobs, many of the jobs that replaced them were the lower wage service sector occupations. So that's really what we're comparing to when we think about what's the quality of the job being created and what will be the benefit of those jobs in communities of color. So relative to service industry jobs, I just want to offer some numbers here to think about what pay in either manufacturing or construction looks like compared to the jobs that are currently available in a lot of these communities. Black workers in the new jobs that would be supported by the kinds of policies we're talking about today would have an earnings gain of about 12.2%. That's about $100 additional on a weekly basis. Hispanic workers would get an increase of about 20%, AAPI workers about 8%, and white workers would get about a 14% earnings increase from these kinds of jobs being created compared to service sector jobs. Now, the other part of that is that when we apply these kinds of investments with an intentional focus on equity and making sure that they reach communities of color and communities that have been struggling economically, as the Biden administration has indicated is fully their intent. These kinds of investments not only have the potential to improve the physical infrastructure in these communities, but they also have a significant direct economic impact on workers and their families in these communities. So do they benefit? There's tremendous potential for them to benefit, and I think that all depends on how we apply and implement the policies and the investments.
Do you have any ideas or any areas about how around implementation? And maybe you do, maybe you don't. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think part of that, again, is making sure that the investments get made in the communities where we see these higher rates of unemployment among communities of color, and that there are the kinds of mechanisms in place to make sure that people in those communities get access to those jobs.
Great.
And there are multiple ways that people do that across the country. Some of my fellow panelists may have some specific thoughts on that
great.
as well.
Thank you. So looking at a different type of infrastructure in a different way, Ted, I know you're very interested, you're a supporter of a new civilian conservation corps. Can you tell people what the civilian conservation, I guess what the old one was and what the new one would be, and why do you and others support an effort to revive it?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. I'm not a historian by nature on the Civilian Conservation Corps, but it came out of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and it was created in 1933, and it ran for 9 years, to 1942. One thing I always like to point out, especially at events like this when people are coming from states, is that most of these really good ideas come from states first. And this is a good example, and there's lots of New Deal examples too. But FDR actually started a similar program in the state of New York, and there was one in California as well. And at its height, I believe it had about 5% of men in the country worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was pretty diverse for that time period, but there were segregated camps. I don't know how much detail I want me to get into.
No, good. I think the detail
women were
is
excluded
important
from it. There's all kinds of problems here. We'll talk about that later. But and the Army was a big role in it, the War Department, and also the Forest Service, and there were camps scattered all across the country where people lived and they worked in constructing things like dams, bridges. They put together over 800 state parks, a lot of soil conservation, back to the Dust Bowl, lots of land remediation type things that they were doing. The WPA was big in that. So it ran for about 9 years, and then they got rid of the program, and there has been attempts to revive that program because it's so iconic. Anytime I go to a state park where I live, there's like a room in the state park where they show you all the old pictures and the CCC, so it really lives in our consciousness that we created something through that process that we still all use today. It's pretty amazing to say you use something that's created, what's my math on that, 90 years ago or 80 years ago. So there's been, there was a version of it put back into place in 1983 by Senator Patrick Moynihan. The American Conservation Corps passed the House, didn't pass. And then, so a lot of programs have been modeled after the CCC. So if you look at Job Corps, which is for, for youth as well, that was, if you look at the founding documents, that's what they sort of held up as sort of the model. And then when you get into the 90s or the 80s and especially in the early 90s, this is where AmeriCorps, sort of the idea, which was created a lot earlier, called something else. And then, the latest version was really, there were several bills put out by several senators. And they ranged in huge scales from like a couple $1 billion to hundreds of billions of dollars. And, there are just very large differences between the past and the present. In a lot of ways, when we did the research on it, I kind of said, I don't know how much this is a Civilian Conservation Corps. And the notable differences were, like, back then it was public employment. You got food, shelter, and you got a wage, and you sent 90% of that back home. And you had to pass a physical test in some ways. There was vocational, learning how to read and write. There were other services, and they were designing, they were building things like buildings. And that can be very difficult. We were talking about industrial policy earlier. And, that's hard these days. I mean, like, you have to, there's all these building codes now. There's a whole host of different laws and regulations, to build like that with youth. It'd be very difficult. But several bills to do that, especially during the COVID pandemic at the height of unemployment. But it's had a lasting impact, and most of the bills, really talked about sending more grants and money back into AmeriCorps type programs. There's thousands of programs across the country, through, and there, there's little smaller programs in the Department of Interior. There's one in the Department of Forestry. So I mean, like, lots of different programs and they just range. One of the things that's very different too, though, is when we talk about public employment, are you talking about public sector employment or private employment? And I think one of the things that's very different back then, that was a public job. And back to the conversation about neoliberalism back a little while ago, we've really shifted things to the nonprofit sector that government used to do, or should do, I would say. Always say, if you see that the chart, the decline of unionization in this country, you'll see a rise in nonprofit employment, and sort of you also see the collapse of many other things, increase in income inequality and things like that. But just coming back to the idea, this was something that was very important, and we, in Appalachia, especially where I live, there's always been a structural unemployment with people who have very large barriers to work, whether it's criminal record, whether it's not having a car, whether it's being disabled, a whole host of issues that make it hard for people to get to work or hard to find employment because it's just not there. And one thing, when you talked about the unemployment rate and you talked about people who are marginally attached, I mean, what about people who are just not in the workforce altogether? And I think for our region, that is the systematic problem. We've had the lowest labor force participation rate, West Virginia, I should say, the area that's entirely in Appalachia, since the very beginning, since that rate has been looked at.
So Ted, first one little factoid and then another question for you. So, you talked about the history, and yes, of course, 1930s, 1940s America, severe racial inequalities, but an important little fact with the Civilian Conservation Corps is that it employed about 200,000 African American young men, which today would be the equivalent about 600,000. So this was a big jobs program, put a lot of people to work, provided income to families during a period of significant hardship. So that's important to keep in mind. So if you could distill it, what's your vision? You know, if you're writing the bill for the new CCC, what do you want? Just give me a few key points.
Do I have to live in political reality?
No. This is your dream bill.
This is awesome. I get that. Well, it would be a state-owned enterprise.
State-owned, okay.
No, I mean, I think one of the big problems with the way the bills have all been written, and this is politics, but when you look at AmeriCorps, most people enrolled in those programs they're college graduates. That is not who we want to focus on. We want to get people into college afterwards, maybe, if that's their choice. But we don't want to send money into beefing up what's creating more I would call an AmeriCorps Plus program. If it was up to me that these would be a public sector job, and they would pay a living wage with benefits, provide housing and food. I mean, I know that's out of touch these days, but I mean, there's the National Civilian Conservation Corps has a couple campuses across the country, and that sort of works a little bit in that way. But there's only a couple thousand other people.
And you mentioned that. So what you just mentioned is we still have a lot of people who don't have a 4-year college degree or don't have a 2-year college degree. So a program like this could help them significantly.
Yeah, people especially coming, out of the criminal justice system, I think that is a huge barrier to work, just getting through that door. This is a program where you can get training. I'd like to see it more located towards getting into apprenticeship programs, so that could be partnering with the building trades and with operating engineers, whatever the union is to do that.
And Benga's in the room, so and he says we need to include rural areas. So is this including rural areas?
Yeah, especially. I mean, I think the original one especially was going into these rural communities. That was one of the bigger focuses. And now we have, like I said, over 800 state parks. I think it's equivalent to about $11 billion in wages today. It's very significant, and it played a huge role, and I think it could play a large role, and especially dealing with that structural unemployment. We talked about different types of unemployment, but that persistent long-term unemployment, helping people get those skills, get into another job after they're going through the Triple C. I think could play a huge role.
And last year I visited a state park in Maryland, and there was a plaque for the CCC. So yes, if you look for it, you'll be able to see it in your national parks and elsewhere. Melissa, I introduced the panel talking about the many places suffering from high levels of unemployment, and Ted was getting into this a little bit. It's important to be aware that the official unemployment rate undercounts joblessness. In most economically disadvantaged communities, many people get discouraged and give up looking for work. But when they do this, they're no longer counted as unemployed. So the unemployment numbers that I gave you are a low estimate of the actual rate of joblessness in those communities. So as high as they were, the real rate of joblessness is likely significantly higher. So Melissa, what could a national subsidized employment program do for these places that are suffering from a high rate of joblessness today? And please start by explaining what subsidized employment is.
I'm here for all of it. Thank you. It's really good to be with you. First, thanks for talking about the CCC. My grandfather was a graduate of the CCC, and it's sort of like coming a little bit full circle here, because I had the opportunity to work on CCC. Thanks for that question. I'll start, I'm going to use the liberty of the mic to just maybe push on a frame that I'd love for us to think about in this session. We're talking about forgotten places and people. And when I was prepping for this conversation, something was like nagging at me. And I realized the thing that was nagging at me was the word forgotten. And so, friends, the definition of to forget means to unintentionally omit or leave behind. And I really think when we're talking about unemployment, underemployment, severe inequity related to wages, related to job quality access, these are not accidents. This is not unintentional leaving behind, right? So I just want to push us a little bit on this frame, because if you know me, you know that I will repeat in every conversation that our policies and systems behave in exactly the way we design them to behave, right? So I just want to use the liberty of the mic to sort of reframe this conversation, because I do not think we are talking about accidentally, unintentionally omitting people and places. So that's my first piece. Subsidized employment, friends, has been around in various forms for many, many years, right? The Civilian Conservation Corps was one example of leveraging public dollars to pay wages, right? Subsidized employment in its current or more recent history examples, we can see as early, or as recently, I should say, as some of the Great Recession implementation of subsidized employment, which reached over 260,000 people across the country, and in which we saw states across the country implement these models, leveraging federal dollars. I want to raise just a couple of points about this, though, because I think it's important to elevate in this conversation, is that a lot of people point to the Works Progress Administration and to the CCC as being sort of like part of the origin story of how we as a country have leveraged subsidized employment, which is true and real. But I think what folk forget is that decades before the Works Progress Administration, we actually saw, as part of the labor movement, conversations about what it would mean for the federal government to have a right to employment, and for the federal government to publicly employ individuals when there weren't opportunities in communities. And so I just want to sort of elevate in this space that we as a country have a very long history of leveraging this policy tool as a mechanism to correct for the divestment in communities, to correct for structural unemployment, right? So my two sort of quick points are one, that history piece, because I think we don't know where we're going with some of these strategies until we know where we've been, right? And secondarily is that I want to point a little bit to the evidence, right? And I've got Callie Grant in the room here, who has sort of been a partner with me for many, many years. And so I cannot stress enough that when we look at the evidence around subsidized employment, we look at over 40 years of research evidence, much of it gold standard research around the effectiveness of these strategies, right? And I can run down the list, friends, but what we know is that these strategies can get people back to work quickly, as you described in the models through CCC. They can get money into the hands of individuals quickly. Awesome, we love for that. We also see ancillary benefits to these programs, like young people whose parents participate in subsidized employment programs being more likely to finish education, right, or to engage in education. We also see benefits to communities because of the economic ripple effect of these programs. And I could go on, but we've got 40 years of evidence around these strategies and multiple implementations around the country. Again, most recently large scale through the last recession, but we have across the country over 19 states and countless communities that are implementing these programs.
So I want to ask you to give a little bit more detail on the same question that I asked Ted. Who can benefit from these programs? Can populations, people who don't have a college degree, people who have other barriers and difficulties, can they benefit from these programs?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we have seen historically with these programs is some combination of either countercyclical or counterstructural implementation of these programs, right? And when we think about individuals facing barriers to employment, we see a number of different populations benefiting from these programs. So we see widespread implementation of these programs, particularly for people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system. We see widespread implementation of these programs for young people, particularly young people who are out of school and out of work. So the short answer to that question is yes, right? And we have seen these programs implemented in a wider scale or sort of broader scale implementation during times of recession. I think one of the things we know from the research, again, and from the modeling of these programs is that these programs particularly benefit individuals who face structural barriers to employment. And when we run the economic modeling relative to poverty reduction, we actually see significantly larger impacts for Black Americans participating in these programs. Significant reductions in poverty, I should say. So the short answer is yes, and we have significant research to demonstrate where we've seen some of these gains.
Great, thank you very much. Anthony, so you've heard your co-panelists talk about these big programs at the national level, in many cases. You're coming from Detroit, working with people in Detroit. Do these programs sound promising or relevant to the current concerns of Detroiters?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm nothing of an economist, but the importance of economic justice meeting these different forms that we adjust to fit our communities is incredibly important. I think all of these are worthwhile, and I think all of these have clear benefits that they've shown for other communities. So why wouldn't they also benefit communities in Detroit? I'll tell you why. I think a big part of what put Detroit in the situation that it was in 10, 15 years ago is the same types of problems that Detroit has been having.
Excuse me, can you explain what the situation is?
Course.
Explain what that means.
So Detroit was one of the first major American cities to go fully bankrupt, to lose all of its true reputation and a lot of the beauty and a lot of the connections to art and culture that we knew it for. And in the last 10 or so years, government has put a major focus on bringing that money back. However, when you lose culture, when you lose people, when you lose the things that make Detroit what Detroit is, you don't get that back by just bringing in money. Where does that money come from? Who is that money coming from? And more importantly, once you bring that money in, once you bring in those new buildings, once you reinvigorate those neighborhoods and you remove the blight, who's going to be there? And so for myself, for Detroit Action, for a lot of grassroots organizations that work in Detroit, before we can even get to the point of having these types of discussions on subsidized employment, we have to make sure that we're getting those people the most impacted into a place where they're able to benefit from it. And it's very hard for us to see how that works in Detroit because we've lost so many of the people who make Detroit what it is, like those legacy Detroiters, people whose grandparents were there from the beginning, who were there during the riots, the people who built their neighborhoods with the support of people around them, with the support of their families. Those people aren't necessarily in Detroit anymore. This is also really, really important because of the conversations had earlier today about, the Great Recession. One less noted impact of the Great Recession was Detroit and the assessments on property tax. So the city of Detroit has admitted that between 2010 and 2016, Homeowners in Detroit were overassessed upwards of $600 million. That's a big number, and it affects people year to year. It impacts people month to month. It impacts what they're able to do as human beings. And it sets so many citizens behind the eight ball on what you can do as far as advancing. Can you save money? Can you put your kids into the best schools? Are you able to actually invest in your home? And so if you're not able to invest in your home, if you spend way too much money just on the taxes and trying to stay in your home, the more that it degrades and dilapidates, the more the city is looking to come and get you out of there so that they can turn it into something else. And so there are so many Detroiters who either lost their homes, were foreclosed on, or evicted, or fought tooth and nail to stay right where they were, and now exist in a state of constant struggle, where all they can do is try to survive and try to get back to where they were before. But at no point is the local government putting in the work to actually help them thrive, to help them contribute to making the city what it once was, instead of what it could be based off of outside investment. You know? And so I think that it really falls upon local government to make up for the things that they've done wrong to their own citizens, but that moves slower than anything you've ever seen. So in my mind, the mayor of Detroit needs to get the fuck up, give these people the money that they deserve, make them whole again so that they can actually create a city that will grow people who are tied into that legacy of Detroit. People who continue to bring that music, bring that art, bring that ecological culture that made Detroit so beautiful and so inviting in the first place, and will bring people in again.
Great, thank you. And the problem that you're speaking about is unfortunately a broad national problem. The Washington Center for Equitable Growth, for example, has a report on their website that shows that minority homeowners end up paying a 10 to 13% higher tax rate on average within the same local property tax jurisdiction. So the people are supposed to be paying the same tax rate within the same jurisdiction, but I won't get into the specifics, but they consistently find that Black and Latino homeowners end up paying significantly more. And as you were saying, people end up losing their homes because they can't keep up with the taxes or end up in other forms of hardship. So this is a problem in Detroit. I think Detroit and Chicago were some of the two cities where they first recognized this problem, but when they looked nationally, they realized it's not just Chicago and Detroit, it's a national problem. So that's a serious issue. Wealth stripping in communities of color, a persistent problem. And Detroit and other cities in the Midwest, we see some of the worst actual racial economic disparities in cities of the Midwest because of deindustrialization. This used to be our manufacturing base. Now it's gone. Those jobs are gone significantly. And also, we've seen significant white flight. So we've seen the wealthiest residents leave the cities, which significantly depletes the tax base of those cities and the ability of those cities to function properly. So that's, I want to bracket that off for a little bit. But Anthony, we've been talking about infrastructure and other investments. The federal government, cities like Detroit, as I mentioned, are challenged because they've lost so much wealth and population and tax rates, so that they have much less in terms of resources than they did 50 years ago. And they have significant challenges. We've heard about the huge water crisis in Flint, That's an infrastructure failure. Are there any other types of, again, thinking about the panel more broadly, any types of infrastructure investments that you think Detroit really needs that the federal government or the state government should step in because they have deeper pockets than the city does because of the depleted tax base, and we know that this could also create significant jobs, like Valerie has said. Your wish list, what kind of infrastructure investments or climate-related investments would you, in your dream world, like to see made in Detroit? Or in similar cities like Detroit? What do you think the industrial Midwest needs?
Right. I think, first of all, to uplift that point of like the industrialized Midwest, like it's not just a Detroit thing because, it's a Milwaukee thing and it's a Cleveland thing and it's a Chicago thing and it's a Minneapolis thing. And like there are so many different parts of the country that are advanced and metropolitan and have these large black populations and, have moved in ways that the rest of the country would hold up as success. But then you reach that level of success where a certain swath of the population decides, well, we're going to take most of it over here. And if you don't give it to us, we're going to leave and let the resources drain out from the bottom. And so Detroit has seen that happen time and time again. And I really feel like the investments that need to come into the city aren't as much about the city as much as they're about the people and how you provide care to the people who are still there. I think that through a racial justice lens, for one, we recognize, like you said, that the homeowners who've been most overtaxed or most overassessed are black and brown homeowners. And so if we know that that's a reality, then we have to look to those communities to figure out how we keep them in their homes. How do we make sure that their homes are actually viable and that children get to grow up in these communities and build the city into something better? Like it can't be, we're just suddenly gonna make Detroit look brand new again in like 5 years. I think it's unfair to everyone, including the mayor, that's even a metric to try and consider, that if you don't solve all these problems that have been built over decades within a 5 to 10 year period, then you failed. But I think the real success has to come from how we treat our citizens in these neighborhoods, how we're changing the ways that policing is done in these neighborhoods, and also where the actual care and support comes from and how we fund it. So are we still pouring tens of millions of dollars into police departments to actually rein in whatever type of crime is happening in these neighborhoods and turning to surveillance that hasn't even actually been tested in major cities across the country yet? Or are we actually bringing people into this space with compassion, with understanding and a mental health and de-escalation background? Like those things go so far in making the city stronger, but also making the people who come from there better. Because if you start off by criminalizing the kids, or if you criminalize black boys who walk around these neighborhoods in Detroit and you say that this is loitering and that they are not trying to better their community, but you are by taking them out of it and putting them into prisons and sitting them back with no actual resources to bring them back into it. Those are all ways that you're setting the city further back, but you're throwing money at it as though it's going to make it better. And so that money has to go to actually building up the people who are there. Less focus on trying to bring in short-term residents who are going to come in for maybe a job and then move on somewhere else. You have to go to where people have already started building those communities. The people who have found ways to outlast the gentrifiers in Detroit. Like those are the people you need to invest in because they know how to keep Detroit in Detroit. More than anything, if I had one wish, potholes. It's all about potholes. It sounds like I'm joking, but it's such a major. It's the ways that potholes impact the way you live, the fact that you don't have a reliable public transit system. You have to have a car, but that car is constantly being broken into pieces. And there's construction happening at all times, but never in your neighborhood. What is that? I know you have the infrastructure. I know you got the means to do it, but you got to bring it to the people who actually need it. And so that's my number one wish.
And as we heard in the room, you're not the only one. I remember an article, and unfortunately I'm forgetting the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. Black mayor got in, and he has all these progressive ideas. I think he was thinking about like universal basic income and all these things, but he said, look, my number one job is potholes. That's the first thing I have to deal with, or else I'm out of office, essentially. So again, to underscore the point, infrastructure is a real serious issue, and like you're saying, it's an asset that has been economically stratified, right? It's the poorest communities, the blackest communities are going to have the worst infrastructure. We talked about Flint and Jackson, also serious water problems. So with that, I have some other questions that are a little in the weeds, but I'm ready to hear from the people in the audience. What questions do you all have? And wait for the mic so that people online can hear your question. And please identify yourself also, and also keep your question a little brief.
I will try. My name's Riley, and I am 19 years old. So let's just throw that out there. It's just been so interesting hearing everyone talk about Gen Z. Like, Gen Z is like far off somewhere as a complicated phenomenon. We're here, we're listening. But besides that, I am from New Orleans, Louisiana, which is one of our major murder capitals right now, which is an oversimplification in a lot of ways, and it always is. But I think listening to Anthony talk about in Detroit and how the solution is really caring for the people and investing in the people and investing in the people who have been there and are really the core of the city, and not just throwing money into like a police system that isn't working and isn't helping. But I think the question that I have right now and kind of for everyone is, how do you develop the will to do that? Because like we can sit here and we can talk about it and like it sounds super great and everyone's like, yeah. And then we go back to our cities and there's nobody who actually wants to do it.
Yeah.
So
Ain't nobody need another paper on the topic. No. Do you mind if I start?
Please, no,
kick this off? Okay, sorry.
All of y'all just jump in and respond.
I have spent the last 20 years in and out of conversations about a true national subsidized employment program, right? And sat at lots of tables and sat at lots of convenings talking about how we might be able to make this a reality. And I too have written all the papers about how this might look, right, and the framework to do it, right? And your question is exactly the question that we should be asking, right? Because there is no shortage of brilliance in this room about how we might make some of these ideas a reality, right, in our communities, right? What we have a shortage of is political will to get it done, right? And unless we are committed to really investing in local communities and bringing people to the table and supporting them and compensating them and building the coalitions and the movements that it will require to do this, we're going to be sitting here at EconCon for the next 20 years talking about these ideas, right? And I don't know about you, but I'm going to be real old at that point. You won't be. You got it. Okay. But I think you hear me, right? I have supported, I have written so many national subsidized employment bills at the federal level, right? And I'll keep doing it, right? And at the end of the day, we have to have resources and commitment to moving beyond the conversation into community to continue to organize, right? And continue to build the energy and the momentum. And I just have to say thank you for that question. That's fantastic. My colleagues, yeah.
That's a really great question. This work is tiring. It's never ending and it's tiring, and you lose people along the way that you think will be there alongside you forever and will have, these shared mentalities and goals. And life makes other decisions for you. And it happens that way a lot. But I think one of the most important things that we can do, and before I even say that, first of all, stop Cop City in Atlanta. And I think that's really important. But I think that one of the most important things we can do is we can uplift narrative skills among everyone and allow people to actually imagine what alternatives would look like. Because I think the thing that holds us back more than anything is that we don't know what to say when people come to us with like, well, if you abolish the police, then what do you do next? I'm like, well, I mean, there's some stuff, but I just haven't thought about it that much yet. And that's where we end up in a lot of cases, but just having a space where you're allowed to imagine it, where you're allowed to read pieces from other people who have stopped and thought about this. There's a poem by a poet in Minnesota that was turned into a children's book with illustrated pages and everything, and it's called, "Can We Please Give the Police Departments to the Grandmothers?" And what better way to start building abolition from the ground up than to have it in children's books? Absolutely. Yeah. That's how we get to that point, because it's not just us thinking about like how we build and sustain political will, but having it as part of our continuous thinking, because it's always there. Everything's political, but we don't always put the time into thinking about how to create political solutions for it. Absolutely.
So these are great responses. Let me just say that yes, narrative and a vision is really important. And to that point, I came across an interesting article in the New York Times about an experiment in Brownsville, New York. I think it's Brownsville, where they're doing community policing. And when I say community policing, it's the community, not the police, but the community is working as the police. They're not arresting people, but they're able to prevent crime without arresting people. So it's a really interesting experiment. It's a tiny, tiny, limited experiment, but it's an idea that we should be having other experiments all over. So I encourage people to look for that. It was this week sometime. The other thing, so narrative vision is really important. Melissa, you mentioned resources and commitment. And when I heard the question, I immediately thought of organizing, right? Because that's the thing. We need, it's great to have a few policy wonks think this is a great idea, but you need a movement essentially to make this a reality, right? So all of you organizers or people who know organizers, what this panel is for is to tell you that we have solutions for joblessness in in communities that, like Detroit, like Flint, like Yuma, Arizona, like Calhoun County in West Virginia. We have solutions for those communities. We have solutions to the needs for school infrastructure, for the broken pipes, for the lack of public transit. We can build public transit. Our public transit is way inferior to public transit in Europe and in many countries in Asia. We're one of the richest countries in the world. Why do we have substandard public transit? So that's my response to this. We need organizing. We need commitment by people with financial resources to help organizers. We need visions. We need narratives. We need culture workers. And that for me is the missing puzzle. We can write the policy papers, but we need the political power to make it a reality.
All of that, and I think we forget sometimes that a key part of the Works Progress Administration was art and the creation of art, right? And I keep thinking about all of this movement building, and I've had the luxury of sitting down with artists at the intersection of art and economic justice recently, and I'm just convinced that a huge part of our movement building needs to include art and how we imagine.
Not just so art where you're not making it for like not for capitalistic goals, not making it for any kind of advancement goals, like just making art, the freedom to make art.
Yeah, the WPA was, I'm glad you brought that up, because when people think about subsidized jobs, another place where people have a really narrow vision, can get a narrow visions, but the WPA, any job you can imagine, there could probably be a subsidized component to it. And the WPA, speaking of narratives, hired people to document the narratives of the enslaved population. Yeah. So our slave narratives in the libraries that we have came out of the WPA.
Yeah,
Do you want to say some more?
I was going to bring that up because I actually found a slave narrative of I think it was my great-great-grandfather that was collected during the WPA. And so, we think now about, what's happening in this country and how there are all these debates about how we talk about race and being honest about the history of race in this country. Those kinds of projects I think would be so important to documenting what's going on and really what the conversation is about and isn't about or shouldn't be about for future generations to really be able to reflect and have a clear understanding of history and politics and policy and economics and all of the things that happen in this country that are so heavily stratified by race and class and gender and all those other things.
Yeah, and the WPA supported artists, like painters. It supported theater. Black theater got significant money from the WPA. So the subsidized employment can be really helpful, and again, can help a lot of people in the most distressed communities. And I see 3 hands up there. I'll let you decide the order.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Jenny from Georgia coming here, Atlanta actually. And actually Atlanta, because a lot of people say Atlanta and they don't live there. But I just wanted to say 2 things, one thing and then ask one thing. So one thing I just wanted to say, echoing on the organizers, let's say protect organizers, because there's a lot of organizing happening and they're not protected, whether it's by pay or by life, right? People are losing their lives on the line and we need to protect our organizers as much as we can. But my actual question to you all is when we think about extreme and radical strategies, like, I don't know, giving people healthcare. Where are you all in trying to make sure that this does happen? Like, what are you hearing in your communities of maybe your local elected officials that are trying to push the envelope to say, we're tired of the status quo, we want to change this? What good strategies you see there, or any other maybe examples examples of elected officials that are doing this work that you all can highlight a little bit about them going above and beyond by doing the most radical thing and helping people live.
Here, if anyone on the panel wants to take it, Callie, do you have any programs, policies, local information that you want to share? Okay, you wait for the mic. Wait for the mic.
There is definitely a lot of amazing stuff always happening on subsidized employment at state and local levels. I know that a couple of years ago, we even talked to folks in DC who were trying to add more of a racial equity focus to the subsidized employment programming. And there's certainly many other places as well that I wish I could remember, but yeah, please do.
Yeah. She has basically an encyclopedia, but
yeah, we are updating our subsidized employment report that Melissa mentioned, and it'll come out later this summer, and we'll have 50 years of subsidized employment programs. So stay tuned.
and many of them are at the local level, right? We're not talking. We want a huge national program, but we have a lot of small experiments in different cities. And the other thing, Melissa and maybe Callie, I see my colleague Haley there, who does work on disability, among other things. What about people with disabilities in subsidized employment?
I want to make sure, did you say you have a colleague here?
Yes. Can you raise your hand, Haley?
Hi. Hi, I'm Haley. I'm Algernon's colleague. I do work on disability and economic justice for folks with disabilities.
Awesome. I just didn't, if you had examples, I wanted to create space for you to share first before I.
I think maybe one of the things that we've been focusing on is reframing ADA accommodations as less of a making sure this is not unduly burdensome and seeing it as a way to improve diversity in the workforce and to enable and empower people who can make meaningful contributions to work. And so to the extent that subsidized employment can be another vehicle for doing that and being part of that reframing and seeing folks with disabilities as an asset rather than a burden, I would love to hear more about the way that your work can potentially be part of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think one of the things that many of us who have been working in these spaces of subsidized employment, designing programs, thinking about equity, right, across multiple different sort of lenses of equity, this is a key piece of the overall puzzle when we think about how to equitably structure, equitably design these programs. One of the principles that the national framework for an equitable subsidized employment program that was put out a couple of years ago by about 17 or 18 national organizations, we elevate and identify in that framework a number of different ways in which both the program structure should be equitably designed, but also what does that mean for employers, right?